Welcome back to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got the whole crew with us, Ben, Wolk, and Kipp Adams on this Sunday afternoon. And fellas, you can't spell sugar without UGA. The Georgia Bulldogs are getting ready for another trip to New Orleans, going to the Sugar Bowl. Georgia secures the number 2 seed in the inaugural 12-team college football playoff. Georgia gets a first-round bye. Georgia will play the winner of Indiana at Notre Dame. They will play January 1st in the Sugar Bowl in the Superdome in New Orleans. Big opportunity, and Georgia sitting pretty as the second highest seeded team, only behind Oregon. Before we get into it and get Ben and Kipp's thoughts, I want to pull up the bracket for those watching us live, and we'll go through this. Georgia, as I said, well, first off, guys, isn't it just beautiful that this is no longer a hypothetical, a what could be? We are actually looking at a 12-team playoff bracket.
When they did the first reveal on the first playoff show, it was gorgeous to see all of the brands and the colors and the logos all in bracket form, and then the ranking form on the side. I loved it. For it to be, this is the real bracket. Like, I almost want to print it off and frame it in my house somewhere just to be able to have the visual of it at all times. I do love it. It is a beautiful looking bracket. And I'm glad that it's finally here so we can stop talking in bogus hypotheticals.
Yeah, I think, Ben, you could probably get Ward Manuel to sign it if you play your cards right. So, as I mentioned, Georgia, number 2 seed. So, Oregon is the number 1 seed. Georgia is the number 2 seed. Boise State is the number 3 seed. Arizona State is the number 4 seed. I will say these are not the college football playoff rankings. This is the seeds for the 12-team field. And I'll be honest, I really don't care about the actual rankings because they don't matter. We're really more focused on the seeding. So those 4 teams, Oregon, Georgia, Boise State, Arizona State, all get byes. Their first games will be in the quarterfinals. Then you look at the matchup, starting with the team that will play the number 1 seeded Oregon. You have the number 9 seeded Tennessee Volunteers playing at number 8 Ohio State. Then you drop down to Georgia, as I mentioned, the number 10 seeded Indiana Hoosiers playing at the number 7 seeded Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Whoever wins that game will play Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. Looking at the other matchups, number 11 seeded SMU. SMU gets the last playoff spot over Alabama. I know we will talk about that later in the show. Number 11 seeded SMU playing at number 6 seeded Penn State. The winner of that will play Boise State. And then the final matchup, number 12 Clemson at number 5 seeded Texas. The winner of that will play Arizona State. So let's start this conversation focusing on Georgia. And I will say this as well. We're recording this. It's almost 1 o'clock. If at any point you see me just disappear from this podcast, or you don't hear from me for a few minutes, I've got my eye on the ESPN College Football Playoff show. I'm keeping an eye out to see if Kirby Smart pops on, mainly because we still don't have an answer on Carson Beck. Now, we do know we are getting Kirby at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. And I know the question will come up then, but just in the event that Kirby makes an appearance on ESPN, I'm going to dip to listen to see what he says. But let's start, Ben, with Georgia's spot in this playoff. They're going to get the winner of Indiana Notre Dame. If it wins in the Sugar Bowl, it would move on to play the winner of Boise State and the winner of SMU Penn State. That'll be that battle that leads to this. What do you think about where Georgia is in this bracket and the path that lies ahead for them?
Well, I think I'm going to get out in front of this, and one of y'all might say this. I think a lot of people are going to look at this bracket and say it's a very favorable draw for Georgia. And I think that you can say that in some respects because you know that you don't have to play. If you make it to the national championship game, you're only going to have to beat one of Oregon, Ohio State, Tennessee, and Texas to get to do it. And so from that respect, you're avoiding a lot of teams that I think are much more losable games for Georgia than some of the matchups that they could have in their side of the bracket. That said, I mean, this is a Georgia team that's played some of the best scoring defenses in college football this year. Texas, multiple times. Tennessee, Ole Miss, all teams in the top 5 in scoring defense. Notre Dame and Indiana are the number 3 and number 6 scoring defenses in college football right now. And so I think that a lot of folks, because they like to be dismissive of everyone else's resumes and strength of schedules and things like that, losses in some cases, like everyone likes to dismiss those things. There are things that those two teams do well, and we've seen, there are moments where Georgia offensively is not absolutely humming, and Jordan alluded to it. We don't know what the status of Carson Beck even is going to be come New Year's Day, and because of that, I don't think anybody, even whatever we watched from the second half of that Texas game, we can say confidently what Georgia is going to look like offensively in that game. It could be better, it could be worse. There's no way of knowing. And so I think because of some of the unknowns around Georgia's offense and quarterback position right now, it makes a lot of these matchups way more compelling, and I think probably will make some of the spreads a little bit tighter than they would have been as well.
I did want to mention, which we will talk about the entire bracket, that they're starting to sort of release what these quarterfinal games will be. As I had mentioned earlier, Georgia will be in the Sugar Bowl. That will be January 1st, 8:45 p.m. Eastern time on ESPN. Oh boy, that's going to be a long night in New Orleans. Boise State is going to be in the Fiesta Bowl. That's December 31st. Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl in Atlanta, that will be Arizona State. And the Rose Bowl, January 1st, will be Oregon. Kipp, what do you think about Georgia's path ahead, where it fell in the bracket, grabbing that 2 seed and waiting on the winner of Indiana Notre Dame?
I don't know if it could have worked out any better for Georgia, honestly. Just the fact that, again, Sugar Bowl, a place where Kirby Smart's very familiar with, having, coached Georgia twice in that game against Texas and Baylor in the past. At the same time, you do look at this bracket, and I think there's a clear preference if you're looking at who Georgia would match up well against for me, and it really has to be Indiana, just for the fact that Notre Dame, Riley Leonard. I mean, that is a guy that, again, they have done well against teams that seem to have prolific offenses. And Ben pointed out the defense, but you also have to look at both these teams. They're number 2 and I think number 3 in the country in scoring as well. They're both prolific offenses against the schedules they face. But I do think that you just look at Riley Leonard and what he brings to the table, having run for over 700 yards and 14 touchdowns this season. That is just an aspect that does, that's a dynamic that we have seen Georgia struggle against quarterbacks that have the ability to extend plays with their legs. That aspect alone just makes it, I do think that the Indiana with Curtis Wolk and a more traditional offense is something where you just look at that team and say, this is a team that I do think Georgia would match up pretty well against overall. So I think we watched the Indiana team, we watched the schedule they played and wondered, really who is this team? And I do think that Notre Dame should be favored pretty strongly in that game, but that's why they have to play them. So I do think you look at that, and then you look ahead to if they do make it to that semifinal round, and you look at the teams, those just seem like teams that Georgia would be able to schematically prepare for fairly well. So in that aspect, on paper, I do think it's as good a draw as you could have really asked for, especially just weeks ago, how we were wondering, not if Georgia gets in or what happens if they lose. And now it's, did Georgia get the best draw? The argument can be made at this point that Georgia really won out and again. And I think, I think that I have to give credit to the committee because they did, help Georgia for the performance they had yesterday. They put, presented this very well, and I think conference championships should matter. We know based on what we heard yesterday that the Georgia players agree with that, and it kind of showed on the field and their performance, and they're being rewarded not just with a bye, but with what seems to be on paper pretty good matchups.
Totally agree. Roger West on Facebook. We can't mess this up. UGA has the easiest road to the national championship game. I would agree, but again, it's just like such a terrible amount of timing, this Carson Beck piece. I mean, that to me throws a humongous curveball into what I would say if Carson was healthy, and this is no dig against Gunnar Stockton, I would say you could write them into the championship game. But we don't really know what is going to happen with Carson. And again, if we hear something, especially if we hear something while we are doing this podcast, we will mention it. But Ben, I mean, to me, the Carson Beck of this situation has got me hesitant to be like, oh, you can lock in Georgia, just because we don't know what they're going to do at quarterback.
Well, like you said, to me, that's not a knock on Gunnar. Gunnar has every opportunity to prove every single one of us wrong. I just think that the unknown about it, I mean, we haven't, until the second half of the SEC championship game, we had not seen Gunnar Stockton take a meaningful snap at Georgia. And obviously that first possession was about as flawless as you could have drawn it up. But then there were other moments throughout that second half where you just don't know. And so I think that that's where my hesitation is, just saying like, oh, I think Georgia has a super favorable draw, because again, I think Indiana and Notre Dame are stronger teams than people have given them credit for at times this season. And I also think that Notre Dame in particular does some things offensively that I think can cause Georgia enough issues with what we've seen Georgia struggle with, that you're going to need some firepower offensively, I think, earlier in this playoff than some people are probably giving it credit. But I do want to add one point, because it's something that I've been on my, high horse about for a while now, that I did not want teams losing conference championship weekend to be punishable. And I meant that from from a seeding standpoint, as well as a staying in the playoff standpoint. Obviously all eyes were on SMU and what was going to happen with that one. But for me, I thought it was equally important for how they seeded Texas and Penn State in comparison to Notre Dame, because I think it, for precedent and things like this moving forward, like some of the same principles are being applied to Texas losing and Penn State losing as would have been applied to SMU losing and falling out behind teams. And I think what they showed, at least in this iteration of the 12-team playoff and the first year of it, that especially if you lose close games in your conference title weekend against good teams that are also making the playoffs, you're not going to be punished. And I think you saw that because Texas and Penn State stay ahead of Notre Dame. And that's why you're seeing Notre Dame on Georgia's side of the bracket instead of some other potential teams that could have been there. I mean, you could be looking at, there was a world where you could have been looking at Texas potentially in that 7 or Penn State in that 7. But I think that the committee did the right thing to re-empower conference championship weekend in multiple ways.
All right, we're probably going to take a break real quick and then talk about the playoff field as a whole. Any of you guys got any other Georgia-specific thoughts before we take this break? Man, we did such a good job in that first segment. We will take a break, come back, and then again, look at this field as a whole, who got in, who got left out, and see what we think about the very historic first 12-team playoff in FBS football. All right, guys, now let's break down this bracket as a whole. I think the biggest conversation going into Sunday was who would get the final 2 first-round byes and who would get those final seeds to make it in. So it was Boise State with the 3 seed and Arizona State with the 4 seed, and they were ranked 9th in the college football playoff ranking. That is Boise State, and Arizona State was 12th in the playoff ranking. But by virtue of having won their conference, they get those 2 first-round byes. And then who would make it in those final spots? And you had SMU as the 11th seed, Clemson as the 12th seed, and then the first team out was Alabama, and the second team out was Miami. And Clemson was locked in because they won the ACC, so it was really SMU, Alabama, Miami. Let's just talk about that piece of it, the final spot to get in. I'll start with you, Kipp. Do you think the committee got it right? SMU in, Alabama and Miami on the outside looking in?
I actually am shocked because I didn't trust this committee to get any of this right at any point, just based on precedent. And they shocked me today because I think they nailed it. I don't think that they got a single seeding off. I think, again, you look at, whether who should be 5, who should be 6, and who should be 7. That was kind of one of the big questions. And I think based on just knowing you don't want to have a all Big Ten matchup, or, you don't want to have Georgia possibly playing Texas a third time, which was, something that was kind of discussed late last night. And yeah, the key here was not punishing Texas and Penn State for losing their conference championship game, because it's stop counting losses. They earned the right to play in that game by winning games during the regular season. And it's something that I'm sure Ben's going to bring up. Like, we focus on the losses and forget the wins. But I think right here, the committee showed that for this week, at least, they considered the right things. And when it mattered the most, in their only ranking that really matters, even though we do these, 6, 7, 8 times, they got it completely right. And it was, for Georgia fans, I'm sure it was entertaining to watch the Nick Saban on ESPN talking about what should matter and the best teams should be in and all the different criteria. When at the end of the day, I think the fact that SMU made it to their conference championship game should have already given them an opportunity to be in this playoff. That should not have been an elimination game. And here we are. It wasn't. Clemson used it as a way to get in, and SMU, had already done enough by getting into that game to get in this field. So, and the seeding, again, I don't think you could have asked for any better seeding top to bottom. These matchups all look very entertaining. You got teams that don't normally play each other. This is what college football is all about. You have your conference schedule. Those are traditions, but then you also have these games where just teams that really don't have a history together get to duke it out for a national championship on the line. And so I just think, I don't know where the future will be for this and what they're going to do and how they're going to react, because they always seem to react. And the conference championships, as Kirby talked about last night, he doesn't know what they're going to do differently. But for this year and this matchup, I think that they knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think I had settled on they would put SMU in, just because taking them out, what that would do to devalue the conference title games. But you just kind of wondered, would Alabama find a way in? I thought they got it right on that front. And I don't know. I mean, I'll be fascinated with how this looks, and we can have this conversation in a few minutes. I want to give Ben an opportunity to talk about SMU in and the other teams that we're not in. But I kind of like having the conference title game winners get a first round bye, because I understand why like a Greg Sankey doesn't want that, because he wants multiple SEC teams to get a bye. But you want to talk about this weekend having some value? Talk about a Georgia team that won. We don't know the quarterback situation, but I know Carson Beck would have a much better opportunity to be able to play in a month compared to a shorter amount of time than that. I like that those buys are in there. I like that adds something to the conference title game. We can talk about that in a few minutes. But, Ben, what do you just think about how this played out, where SMU gets in, Alabama and Miami on the outside looking in?
Well, I think that 11-win SMU was in over 9-win Alabama last week, and I think that 11-win SMU should have been over 9-win Alabama this week. I don't think for anything changed for me just because SMU earned a 13th game that Alabama didn't. So to me, it was a simple answer. I think it became a more complicated answer because of the program that was in the debate. I think that, again, like if it was 9-3, South Carolina was the only SEC team that was in the conversation, I don't even think it would have been a debate. I think it would have been so easy for everyone, but it's very easy to default to, well, it's Alabama. They win a lot of games. They beat Georgia. Like you can point to things with Alabama and there's always a justifiable argument about it. But again, to me, the empowering conference championship weekend was very important to me because I don't want them to go away. And I think that if they could have put 11-win SMU behind 9-win Alabama and said, hey, you've got to earn your way into the playoff. But when they didn't do that, to me, outside of just something catastrophic happening to SMU, there was no real explanation other than, well, it's Alabama, for why Alabama should have jumped in and taken that spot. So I feel really good about, like Kipp said, I mean, at 8:25 this morning, I put out this exact bracket. So, I mean, I think that I agree with the seeds, and I don't need to, pat myself on the back, even though that I will multiple times over. But yeah, I think that they got this one exactly right. And I've long said, I think that the committee is more predictable, especially once you have gotten to the end of the regular season. From the end of the regular season to championship weekend, I do think that they are much more predictable. Last year, I did not expect them to bounce Florida State out, but I did not expect Georgia to get into the playoff last year, given how championship weekend went and that there were 5 power conference champions ahead of them. So I just think that they are much more reliable in how they handle seeding and rankings than they get credit for. And I also think that from the end of the regular season to championship weekend, there's been more consistency than people talk about. Like, people act like they do outrageous things all the time. And I don't think that's true, because I think that if that was true, I wouldn't have gotten every single one of these seeds right this morning when I put it out.
All right, I want to bring back the conversation I brought up a few minutes ago. I like that there is these automatic buys. Now, some of the conferences like the SEC want to get rid of them because only one of their teams can get it. But I like keeping value in these conference title games. And I like that, hey, if you didn't win your conference, okay, you can still make the playoff, but we're not going to reward you for playing one less game. Ben, do you feel as strongly as I do as far as I want them to keep these buys? I know there's a lot of people frustrated with it. And, oh, my gosh, we got a 12-seed Arizona State that gets a bye and a 9-seed Boise State. Well, then win your conference and we won't be having this conversation.
Here's my frustration with it. Like, I get it. I don't think that Arizona State and Boise State are 2 of the 4 best teams in the country. Neither did the committee. They put 2 other teams in their top 4. Like, they are acknowledging that. Everyone wants to be a part of these conferences. They want to be a part of the SEC and a part of the Big Ten because of all of the amazing things that come with it. The money, the exposure, the big time games, the inflation that you're going to get when you're talking about your resume and things like that when it comes to committee making decisions when you lose 2 and 3 lost games. I mean, Boise State and Arizona State couldn't have lost 3 games and even been in the conversation. Boise State couldn't have lost to any other team that they lost than the one that they lost to and been in this conversation. And so, for me, you can't sit there and want to be in these conferences and tout how great your conference is at all the time, be so proud of your conference and everything. And then when it comes time to it, be upset that you being in that conference had some negative repercussions. Like, yeah, when you're going to be in a great conference, there are going to be more chances for you to lose a game. And so some people would rather it be an SEC Big Ten Invitational. I think most years it's going to be an SEC Big Ten Invitational. I think that Notre Dame, whenever they're having a good year, they're going to infringe on one of those big conference spots more often than not. And I think that when you have a league like the ACC, where the issue, I think more so for Bama and some of the other things was like there were 3 ACC teams in the top 13. And so there, throughout the course of the year, you talked about Miami, there was Clemson at times, SMU was hanging around the entire time. There were multiple ACC teams where there was a point if Clemson had beaten South Carolina and Miami had beaten Syracuse that they could have gotten 3 teams into the playoff depending on how things shook out. And so I think it just reached a point in the year where it was hard to envision the ACC, the Big 12, the group of 5 only getting 3 teams in, and then 9 spots being for the Big 10, the SEC, and Notre Dame, which I think most years probably will be 8 or 9 teams from those conferences. This is just the rare year where I don't think that that's going to happen because the SEC beat itself up probably more than it typically does.
Yeah, I think that's totally a fair point. Kipp, what do you think as far as keeping these automatic buys for conference champions?
I mean, you have to there's some give and take here. And I think that, sure, you can make the argument that, Texas and, either Ohio State or Penn State, if we're trying to talk about 4 best teams, that you could put them in the 3 and 4 seed. But both conferences got 3 teams in. And I think the focus, as we've said for, the last couple of days, is we got to continue to make sure that these conference championships matter or else, because you're not going to get rid of them. We've said that because there's too much money involved. So if we're going to keep these games, make them matter so that these players, continue to have the motivation to play with them. And I think if you're just looking at Georgia now, as we've said, how valuable is this buy now for Georgia? Every single day that you have to potentially heal and get your players available, is really invaluable for Georgia right now. And moving forward, I think that lesson's been learned. A month ago, you had Lane Kiffin saying, "Oh, the SEC coaches, we've all said we'd rather miss this game and just know that we're going to get in." And now who's he playing? In this college football play, if he's not playing anyone, he learned his lesson the hard way. And I think, Georgia learned its lesson, and like the best way possible is that, okay, you know what? I'm glad we played in this game, because not only are we conference champions, but we get this valued by, and we get this, what looks on paper to be pretty favorable seating. We'll find out. It may not be, but right now, as we're discussing this, it looks like it worked out pretty well for the SEC champions, and that's the way it should be. You have to place as much value as you can. I don't think there's a way to make the game more valuable, and just making it the 4 seats being Big Ten and SEC. I'm sure that, for Greg Sankey and the Big Ten, and for fans of those conferences, sure, that would be great. But I just think for college football in general, that's not good for the sport. And the fact that these teams are in here for winning their conference championships, that's great for the sport. And so I just think that the way this is, and to Ben's point, as far as the committee, not getting it as, doing a better job than what we thought. I think the 12-team field gives them more runway to not screw it up. It provided them with easier decisions to make, and that's fine. I think the system as it is really as good as we've had. And people wanted to go back to the BCS, and we've seen that, and we've thought about that. But right here, this is great football on paper, and it's a great situation. And rewarding conference champions is just really healthy for a sport that's going through as much change as it's ever experienced.
I just want to circle back to tying this back into Georgia as well. I mean, you look at the field, a quarter of the field was on Georgia's schedule this year. Georgia went 4-0 against those teams, and 3 of them were double-digit victories. So, we've talked all year about how difficult this schedule was, and some of their losses now are not even appearing in the playoff. And those were, borderline playoff teams as well. But for Georgia to have had the success that it had this year, given some of the flaws that we've talked about all year long, for them to be 4-0 against playoff teams, and those playoff teams making up a quarter of the field, it says a lot about this Georgia football team.
All right, I got one more trick up my sleeve before we end this, but before I pull it, do any of you have any other thoughts on the bracket and just the start of the playoff?
I mean, I can't wait, man. What's the Friday night game? Is that Indiana Notre Dame? Have we heard that yet? I'm assuming it probably is.
I haven't taken a look, to be quite honest, at the days yet.
It can't get here soon enough for me. I'm itching for it already. There's too much time. I mean, I know all the coaches are happy. They've got game planning and rest time and deal with their, portal week time. But I can't wait for that first game. It's going to be electric watching these games in these home environments.
All right, this is the last thing before we close out of here. I want your guys' predictions of who's in the championship game and who wins it. I will start, since I'm the one posing the question. I think we get the number 1 seed versus the number 2 seed. I think we get Oregon and Georgia. 2 years ago, we saw that game to open the Dan Lanning era. I think that Oregon is back in Mercedes-Benz, plays Georgia. And I'm going to say the Ducks win the national championship. It's because of the quarterback situation. I think that we're probably not going to see Carson Beck again this season. Again, this is not me reporting that. We are going to see, and we're going to hear from Kirby at the very least in about an hour from when we're recording this, and maybe sooner if he pops on ESPN. But I'm giving Oregon the edge. I will say I kind of like the idea of maybe Ohio State making a run and potentially beating them and playing in the national title, especially after all the Ryan Day stuff. But I'm sticking with Dylan Gabriel. I'm sticking with Dan Lanning, Oregon and Georgia in the national title, and Oregon wins it. Ben, who are your teams in the national title, and who wins the national title?
Well, I do think Ohio State's the team that's primed to make a run. They've only lost close games. I think that there is going to be it's a weird situation. Ryan Day might be in if you don't win the national championship, you lose your job type of deal. And there's a lot of people around him that might be in that situation as well. I don't have any knowledge of that, obviously. I'm just looking at the way that fan base is behaving around him right now, that it makes me feel like ice is very, very thin. So I think that they are going, they get the home matchup against Tennessee, which was a very favorable committee decision. That 8-9 decision is a big one that the committee has to make every year now, because it means home versus away for both of those teams, even though you feel like they're basically the same team in your rankings. So I think that Ohio State does make a run. I think that they get it done against Oregon like they did not the last time. I think that it would be an Ohio State-Texas matchup, and I like that Ohio State defense to get the job done and the skill players to be able to find a way. I think that game would look a lot like the Georgia-Texas game looked last night. On the other side, I mean, if I knew what Georgia's offense would look like with Gunnar Stockton full-time, I would feel a lot more confident in just putting Georgia in there. I do think the winner of the Georgia-Notre Dame game will be playing for the national championship game. I'll say Georgia, Ohio State, Peach Bowl rematch. Georgia gets the win, finds a way. If Georgia wins this national championship, it will be among the most miraculous national championships that there's ever been, especially if Carson Beck's not able to go. I know I've been talking a lot during this episode, like I'm thinking it's a foregone conclusion, but a lot of that is operating on just the way that it looked with Carson yesterday. I'm not very optimistic.
No, I think it's very fair to say that. And yeah, that Ohio State, I think if Ryan Day wins the first round, I think he's still going to have a job. But I mean, it's definitely not a guarantee. And man, what a storyline that would be if they make a run, wind up playing for the national title. There was some, Blackbeard's Ghost on YouTube says Ohio State versus Georgia in the Natty with UGA taking it all. So we'll see if he's right about that. Kipp, what do you think? How does this play out? Who's playing for the national championship and who winds up winning?
I agree with you guys on Oregon simply for the fact that I think in this situation, it really is going to boil down to quarterback play. And I mean, Dylan Gabriel has probably been the best quarterback in college football this season. I think that's not really a leap for me to say something like that. Now, honestly, I'm looking back to that Indiana Notre Dame game and going, are the second and third best quarterbacks playing in that game? I don't know. I think as far as this setup, I think a Rourke Leonard matchup is very intriguing. That game's gonna be Friday night, I believe, 8 p.m. And so that's gonna be so entertaining to watch. I feel pretty confident in saying that it's going to be someone from Georgia's bracket that's playing Oregon in the national championship game based on that fact. And like you guys said, we don't know what Georgia's quarterback situation is, but the way that, the defense just played, it feels like when the lights are the brightest, the defense comes up and makes stops when they need to. I think they're set up well to, regardless of who they face in that round, to come out and then perform pretty strongly. So you know what? I will say that if Georgia is able to beat Notre Dame, I think they're in the game. But I do think that Dan Lanning's team is matched up pretty well to kind of, I guess, get a revenge game against Georgia and the apprentice and the mentor type matchup. So I do think Oregon set up well for this, but like we said before, this is the most unpredictable Georgia team we've ever seen. So let's count them out and see if they make us look bad over the next 6 weeks.
They've done a great job of doing that. Primetime Dog on YouTube says UJ wins the Natty and Kirby I trust. And I can't blame anyone who just says, look, I'm going with Georgia because why the hell not? Because they just, like Kipp just said, they keep proving people wrong. I was wrong about the SEC title game, and we talked about this on the post-game pod. Starting the third quarter, there was no way I could have felt more confident that Georgia's not going to win this game when Gunnar went out there. And that's a credit to Gunnar, and that's a credit to the coaching staff and all those players, man. They will not lie down and die. And that is a really commendable trait, because it's very easy to get discouraged, and this team just won't do it. All right. Any parting thoughts before we end this podcast?
I mean, I've already said my parting thoughts, Jordan. I need this thing to get here ASAP. I need knowing that we're also going to be able to sit back and probably enjoy some of these first round games as well. Oh, Jordan, I know you appreciate that more than I do.
I can't wait. Kipp, any final thoughts?
Well, I think the good news is now that we know this and Georgia's not playing next week, we can all sit back and relax and know that there's absolutely nothing newsworthy that's going to happen the next couple of days. For us, we just get a chance to catch our breath because Jordan, Ben, can you guys, is there anything on the schedule that might, take up any of our time?
The transfer portal opens on Monday. All right, everybody, we're going to wrap up the episode right there. I appreciate Kipp for setting me up. Appreciate Kipp and Ben both for popping on for this podcast. Thanks everyone who watched it live, everyone who is watching or listening to it after the fact. Go subscribe to Dawgs247.com. Go subscribe to the Junkyard Dawgcast wherever you get your podcast. Go subscribe to our YouTube, our TikTok. We have a lot of really good videos from the SEC title game, the players coming off the field. Warren Brinson carrying the SEC championship game trophy. They were pumped after that, but player interviews. And then basketball, too. There will be something going on next week with Georgia men's basketball playing in Atlanta against Grand Canyon. I'll be there for that, so we'll have more good stuff there. So for Ben Wolk and Kipp Adams, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.